My pals, let us light up the darkness. Today's page from the Talmud is a beauty, and it's got some language in it that you're going to find quite familiar. We're going to get at that toward the end of today's daf. Who's in the house? Say hello, put something in the comments, hit the like and the love, signal to Facebook. We're doing something of value here. Remember, when you comment, when you like and love, when you share, that's really the best, then you signal to Facebook that this class, this teaching, this group of people learning together are creating value in the social media universe, and more people should be alerted to it. Hello, James Roth from Indianapolis. Always great to see you. You are a true light. We're trying to light up the darkness everywhere in the world. You're lighting it up in Indianapolis. Who else is in the house? What cities, what countries, what continents? Who is with us today? Deborah says hello. Deborah Renee Hazelwood. Hi, Deborah. How are you? We're going to be talking about page 12 in Tractate 1 of the Talmud. This is Berachos Daf Yud Beis. Excuse me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol yehudi v'ra. Okay. So, this is a busy daf. You guys are going to really enjoy this, I'm sure. Just to set the scene, we've been discussing the blessings which accompany the daily recitation of the Shema, the declaration of God's unity. There are 3 paragraphs that go along with the Shema, and we're going to be discussing the 3rd paragraph of the Shema, and that's why I'm wearing this Arba Kanfot, 4-cornered garment that has the Tzistzis on it. We're going to be talking about that a little bit later. Right now, we're talking about the blessings that we say before and after the Shema. They include, blessed are you, Lord our God, who creates light and forms darkness. Blessed are you, who has loved us with an abounding love. And the sages open this page of the Talmud by saying that if one recites the Shema without saying one or both of these blessings before, nevertheless, he has fulfilled his obligation. Right? You have fulfilled your obligation to say the Shema if you don't say the blessings, but it is improper to say the Shema without saying those blessings. And so it is just, we're trying to do things properly, right? The sages established the order of the prayers, and we believe in the authority of the sages that has been handed down to us. This comes back to the Torah that God said, in every generation you will listen to the leaders, and the leaders of each generation adopt the sort of teachings and commandments of the previous generation, unless there's some extremely compelling reason to change things. And there never has been a compelling reason to change the order of the prayers. And so it is proper to say these blessings before. Speaking of the daily prayers, the sages tell us that even at the time that the Mishnah and the Gemara were being compiled, right, so the early part of the first millennium, sort of late Second Temple period, which ends in the year 70, and then they kept sort of figuring things out for the next 130 years, and then they set down the Mishnah, and then for the next 300-400 years after that, the Gemara. But even in the late Second Temple period, we learn that the practice of reciting the 10 Commandments daily in synagogue had already been abolished, right? So from this we know that prior to the abolition of reciting the 10 Commandments daily, it was a practice throughout ancient Israel to recite the 10 Commandments every day in synagogue. That's good. So now we know, first of all, that they had synagogues, right? So it wasn't only that there was the ancient temple in Jerusalem. People would go when they had to make a sacrifice, and they would make the thrice yearly pilgrimages, but that they also had local synagogues, and indeed we have found architectural evidence of that. During our visit to Israel last summer, we saw, for example, on the way to Masada, this ancient and beautifully preserved synagogue and its tile floor. So in these local synagogues, oh my gosh, Lauren Krieger's in the house. Happy birthday, Lauren. You just completed a nice one. Miss you, buddy. So they had synagogues and they recited the Ten Commandments every day. Why did they abolish the practice of reciting the Ten Commandments? Seems like a good practice. They abolished it because back then there were heretics who said, well, we believe, these heretics, that God spoke the Ten Commandments, but we don't believe that God spoke the whole Torah, right? Our sages teach that when Moses was on top of Mount Sinai, he received not only the Ten Commandments, but also that God dictated the whole Torah to him. He wrote it down. We call it the 5 books of Moses, but essentially Moses was the secretary, right? It was God giving dictation. And so everything that is in the Torah is, the divine word of God, dictated to Moses by God. These heretics back then said, no, God only spoke the Ten Commandments, and then the Torah was written by Moses and by other people who came after him. And if we were reading the Ten Commandments aloud in synagogue each day, so that would embolden those heretics to say, see, that's why you say the Ten Commandments every day, because you acknowledge that those words have more precedence. They're more important. Why are they more important? Because God spoke them, and the rest was just an early commentary. Lest people think that and believe those aggravating heretics, the sages did away with the practice of reciting the Ten Commandments every day. When do we hear the Ten Commandments? In synagogue. So twice a year, it's part of the Torah reading, of the weekly Torah reading. And when the Ten Commandments are recited in synagogue, we do give them special respect. Everyone in the congregation stands up when they are read. Excuse me. But we no longer have the daily reading of the Ten Commandments. We continue, and some of the lessons that we learn about what we say in daily prayers, were based on blessings that the priests would say in the Holy Temple. And a particular blessing that they would say was kind of interesting. So even by the time the first temple was built, there were already more priests than were needed, right, at any given time to fulfill the temple function, right? So the priests are all descendants of Aaron, and then his sons, Aaron, Moses' brother. But there had already been a lot of generations between, being in the desert, and it's only 400 years later that David sort of collects all the materials to build the temple, and then Solomon actually builds it. And in David's time, he and the prophet Samuel would institute a system where there would be 24, they were called watches. So there were 24 groups of priests, 6 families in each one, 6 paternal families. And so each watch, right, each of these groups of priests would serve for 1 week twice a year. And then they would rotate through, right? So there were 24 groups like that. And the only time that all the priests would be in the temple would be during the pilgrimages, particularly Yom Kippur and Pesach, right? And so when everyone is coming together, I'm sorry, not Yom Kippur, but particularly Pesach, you can imagine when everyone is coming to Jerusalem and to eat the Passover offering and make the Passover sacrifice, and the sacrifice itself had to be slaughtered by a priest, so they needed a lot of priests. But otherwise, it was just a small subset, sort of like 1/24 of all the priests would be in the temple each week. And the shift would switch from one watch to the next watch on Shabbat. And the outgoing priests from the week before would give this blessing to the incoming priests. And it was a nice blessing. They would say to them, "May he who caused his name to dwell in this house cause love and brotherhood, peace and camaraderie to dwell among you." Lovely sentiment, beautiful blessing. If only they had come up with the idea of giving this blessing simply because they love each other. They realized that they needed this blessing because of a tragic event. It's not described in this page, I'm not sure exactly where in the Talmud it is. We'll encounter it, God willing, in our 7.5-year journey. But there was an incident where, in sort of earlier times, when the new watch would come into the temple, some of the younger priests would have a competition to see who was going to, I don't know if it was to, make the first sacrifice, or, it was some form of zealous competition to see who would get the honor, I think, of maybe conducting the first sacrifice on the altar, or that day's sacrifice on the altar, whatever it was. They would actually have a race, through the temple courtyard and up the ramp. And because they were so motivated to get that honor, whatever it was, just pride to beat the other guy, or just genuine love to be the first one to serve God, whatever the purpose was, it was such a stiff competition to win that honor that they would push and shove and elbow each other out of the way. And once, I think, one of the priests fell off the ramp and was seriously injured, perhaps even killed. And so then the older, wiser priest said, okay, we need to remind the young guns, as it were, don't be so zealous that you forget, the peace and well-being of your holy brothers, right? It's like you've lost the plot if that's what you're doing. And that's why that blessing was instituted. And so it just sounds good, may peace and brotherhood be with you, but sort of understanding that history, we understand how even the best intentioned people striving to do good for God and for the world and for the people can lose the plot and just kind of become a little bit ego and pride driven and end up hurting other people, even in the midst of such a holy activity as the holy service in the temple. Let's continue. We also learn on this daf, if you've been to a synagogue, if you go to synagogue regularly, you know that we bow. We stand and bow, and there's different times in the service that we bow. So when we are actually doing the prayer, by which the sages mean the Amidah, the standing prayer, or also called the Shmona Esrei, the 18 blessings, but the main part of the morning, afternoon, and evening prayer, at the beginning of it, right, so we would say, Baruch, I would be standing if I was in temple doing this, but Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Elohei Avoseinu, right? Blessed are you, Lord our God, God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, etc. But there's a choreography of this that on Baruch, blessed, we kneel, or we bend the knee, we don't kneel all the way to the ground. Atah means you, we bow. And then when we say the name of God, Hashem, we stand. And you might think, well, wouldn't you want to be bowed when you're saying the name of God? And no, the answer is we bow before God, before, like in the presence of God, and literally before we say God's name, we've already bowed. Why? Because we have a teaching from the Psalms that God straightens the bent, or in other words, raises those who are bowed down. Right? And so we kneel, Baruch, when we bless, and then we bow when we say you, and then saying God's name straightens us. And it's a nice thing to remember that invoking God's name empowers us, strengthens us, raises us when we're bowed low. Then we learn, it's a lot of different things in this one little page, right? Then we learn about King Saul, Shaul in Hebrew. He was the king before King David, and he lost the kingship not only for himself, but for his family. His dynasty was not established, and instead the kingship went to David and his heirs forever. What did Saul do? Well, he made a number of mistakes, but basically he didn't listen to God as God's will was revealed to him by the prophet. And then when he realized that he'd done wrong, he became ashamed. And we learn from this that shame can be holy. There is such a thing as holy shame, and that holy shame, genuine, sincere shame over our actions helps us atone. It can even bring a complete atonement if the shame is real, if it's sincere, right? Holy shame means you see it, right? You see what you did wrong. You understand why it was wrong. Now, over the centuries, our sages have added to this that, just becoming aware of your transgression and being determined not to do it again does not complete your atonement. But it's perhaps the most important part. Very important. If you don't achieve that, okay, then you're never going to have a real atonement. You're never going to really improve yourself. You're not going to, sort of move forward and evolve and move up that ladder of goodness and holiness. You've got to be able to achieve holy shame. Now, in the case of King Saul, we know that his atonement was not complete because what happened was when his shame, he realized what he'd done wrong and he admitted that he was ashamed of it. So the prophet said to him, well, tomorrow you're going to be with me. This prophet was already dead. I'm just blanking right now, but it must have been Shmuel, right? So it must have been the prophet Samuel, and who had already passed away, and so he, what Saul did was in his wars that he was doing and pursuing David, etc. He ended up killing a bunch of priests, and obviously realized that he had done wrong. He couldn't consult with the priests to sort of get an answer the normal way. When a king has a question that needs to be answered in his capacity as king, he consults with the high priest and the Urim and Thummim, which are, it's this method of asking God. Usually you're only supposed to ask God a king would only ask God for an answer in matters of war, national matters of national security, as it were. But here he sort of consulted with a necromancer who opened the channel for him to communicate with the dead prophet Samuel. And Samuel said, well, number one, you shouldn't have bothered me. Number two, you're going to be with me tomorrow. It was on the eve of a battle. Samuel's already dead. So what he's saying is you're going to die in the battle tomorrow. And that is what happened. But our sages also learn out from this incident that Saul joined the prophet Samuel after death, right? Samuel is in heaven in a nice spot, right? We believe in a kind of hierarchical paradise, hierarchical next world, or in the world of souls, and that Saul would have a nice place in that world of souls alongside the prophet. And if his sin was so grievous, how could he end up in such a nice spot? And the answer is that his shame, combined with his death, atoned for his sins, and he was able to move on. Here I'd like to invoke my dear friend of blessed memory, Rabbi Shlomo Schwartz, known to many around LA as Schwartzy. And he did a short video commentary on the film that Nina and I made about Passover called When Do We Eat? And in that movie, there's a character who is, sort of newly religious and trying to make himself into a better human being. And he slips, and he really slips, and he does something, quite wicked during the night of Passover in the dysfunctional family household, the Stuckman family household. And in the commentary on the movie, Schwartz is having a discussion with a couple other rabbis, and one of the rabbis, Mordecai Finley, taught about holy shame. So he was talking about how shame can be so holy. And Schwartzy answered, shame can be holy. Shame is necessary in our growth. But shame must not become paralyzing, right? You can't wallow in shame. You have to become aware of what you did wrong. You have to become aware of how you reached a place where you would do that sin. You have to resolve not to do it again. And then you have to get on with the business of living. Why? Because eventually your atonement won't actually be complete, according to Maimonides, until that situation comes again, right? The situation in which you sinned last time, you succumbed to temptation. Eventually you'll face that temptation again. It'll come up again in your life. And as a result of the shame that you felt, and the working on yourself, and the atoning, and the prayer, and whatever practices you brought into your life to make yourself that more of a menschy human being. So then when it comes back around to that same situation, and you could do that sin again, and you don't, that's when your atonement is complete. And Schwartz was saying is that if you get paralyzed in shame, you won't get on with the business of living, and you won't come back to that situation and have grown sufficiently to handle it. All right. Then, this is all in Daf Yud Beis, all on page 12 of Brachos. Now we come to a discussion of, we're talking about the blessings that we say before and after the Shema. Now we're talking about the Shema itself. Right, so people often, when they say that, when they talk about the Shema, they just mean the first line, right? Teaching it, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Listen, O Israel, God, our God, God is one. That's the line. And, we say that when we go to sleep at night, and we hope we'll have an opportunity to say it just before we die. It's that fundamental of a declaration. But when we speak about the Shema, we can also be including the sort of the whole Shema. And the Shema has that first line and then 3 paragraphs which follow it. The first paragraph, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and all your resources, etc. The second paragraph sort of recapitulates the first and also talks about that if Israel as a nation will conduct itself in holiness, if we will as a group love God with all our heart and soul, then things will go well in the nation. And if as a group we neglect to love God and to behave properly, we will lose the gift that we were given, the Holy Land of Israel. And indeed, that came true. In ancient Israel, eventually, the people didn't behave properly and lost the land. The third paragraph of the Shema is what the rabbis are talking about now, and they're asking, why is it included? Why do we include the third paragraph? Answer, because it includes 5 elements that are just key to being a righteous person, particularly to being a righteous Jew. Right, there are 5 key elements in the third paragraph of the Shema that help us be a righteous Jew and remain a righteous Jew. Right. So, what is the third paragraph? Spoke Hashem to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say, put a fringe, a tzitzis, on your garments." So this would be on the corners of your garments. Right. Put a fringe on the corners of your garments. So to do that, you need a garment with corners. In the old days, they basically all wore ponchos, right? So it was a 4-cornered garment with a hole in it, and then a belt around it, like that's what they wore. Now we wear pants and shirts, etc. And so a religious Jew will wear a garment like this. Some people wear it over their shirt. A lot of people wear it under their shirt. I'm actually wearing one underneath my shirt right now, kind of lightweight one. Well, where is it? This thing here, between my t-shirt, my undershirt, and my shirt. But for demonstration purposes, I'm wearing this one over. I got this one in Uman, Ukraine during the annual gathering at Rosh Hashanah. It's dear to me for that reason as well as others. And in Uman, it's like all men, there's only men there basically. 80,000 guys, welcoming Rosh Hashanah, welcoming the New Year together. And it's a time of very elevated holiness. And there's just a lot of people walking around with this garment on outside their clothing. The point is, and you shall put tzitzis on the corners of your garment, and you will put a blue thread in the tzitzis. So it's 1 blue thread of the 4, but it's doubled when it passes through the hole and comes back, and then gets knotted a very specific way. And then here it is, right? And the third paragraph continues. You'll put a blue thread in the fringe on the corners, in the tzitzis on the corner, so that whenever you look at the fringe, you will be reminded of all my commandments and to do them, and that you will do them, right? You'll be reminded of my commandments and you will do them, right? I always say this kind of fast when I'm reciting in the morning. I'll just open it up so I have it here in front of me, right? And to do them, and you will not stray after your heart and your eyes, which you stray after them. It is for you to do all the commandments, so that you'll remember to fulfill all my commandments, and be holy unto the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. That's the third paragraph of the Shema. What are the 5 elements that are so important in the third paragraph that cause this paragraph to be added into the daily recitation of the Shema, morning and evening? Excuse me. Number 1, the Exodus from Egypt. Right? We are to remember that God brought us out of Egypt all the days of our life. Number 2, that we take on ourselves the yoke of the mitzvah. Right? It's called Kriya Shema. When we say the Shema, right, we're accepting the yoke of heaven, meaning we submit. Right? We submit, and we remind ourselves morning and evening that we submit. Our lives, our destinies, our wealth, our families, all of it is a gift from God. We don't own it, right? We didn't earn it. We do earn it with our work, but the opportunity to work hard and earn these things was given to us by God. And just because we've been commanded, and because we, love God and have awe of God, we submit to the commandments, and we remind ourselves that we submit. And this fringe that we wear on our clothes is meant to be a visual reminder of that. What are the other 3 elements? They're a little bit hidden, right? They're a little bit hidden. From that you stray after your heart, right? Because you shall not stray after your heart and your eyes. From straying after your heart, what's actually implied there is that in your heart, you might deny God. In your heart, you might say, I don't really know if there's God. I don't know if God is really, watching or cares or even able to, maybe he made the world, but he's not really interested in me, or maybe he's not even able to run the affairs of all mankind. This is the kind of thought that a person might have in their heart, and you need to overcome those kind of thoughts. Straying after your eyes, right? We're trying to be empowered to control our eyes. Why? Because our eyes will draw us after licentiousness, lust, right? It's the eyes that draw people to become sexually, to pursue prohibited sexual pleasures. And finally, and you shall not stray after your heart and your eyes, which you stray after them. It is repeated. And what does it mean to stray after them? Now he's talking about avodah zarah, idolatry. You might deny God in your heart, and you might pursue other gods. Back then, the temptation to pursue other gods, to bring tangible, and I would even say fashionable idols into the home was so strong, when you're talking about 3,000 years ago and then 2,500 years ago, that there was a dream that we'll encounter later in the Talmud, when people who lived about 1,000 years ago and were looking down on the people who lived 2,500 years ago and saying, they're so weak they couldn't overcome the temptation to have idols in their houses. It's ridiculous. Who wants to bow to a little statue that doesn't do anything? And then in his dream, this king, Menashe, who we actually mentioned yesterday, he's a son of Hezekiah, said to this guy in his dream, you have no idea how tempting it was to run after idols. If you had been there, you would have, hitched up your skirt to run faster to get into that temple of idolatry. And indeed, when we judge other people and say, the thing that they succumb to is ridiculous, I would never do that. At least I don't have that problem. So you don't know, right? You don't know. If you walked in another person's shoes, you might realize just how tempting it is to succumb to the sins that they succumb to. So those are the 5 reminders built into the third paragraph of the Shema, and that's why it's included. We finish this daf, Yud Beis, with some very, very familiar lines, even for the Jew who has never studied Talmud. If you've been to a Passover Seder, so you have heard from the Haggadah, the Passover Haggadah. Where is it? This teaching, the Exodus from Egypt, is mentioned at night, adjacent to the recitation of the Shema, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, I am like a man of 70 years old, but I was never privileged to prove that there's a biblical obligation to fulfill this accepted custom of recounting the Exodus from Egypt at night, right? We recount the Exodus from Egypt in the Shema, and we do it at night as well as in the morning. And so everybody did it, but Elazar ben Azariah couldn't prove why we do it until Ben Zoma interpreted it for me, right? We all have seen that in the Haggadah, and this is what they're talking about. They're talking, in the Haggadah we talk about Passover, but that discussion is from this page in the Talmud, and what they're actually discussing is the obligation to recount, to say, God, you brought us out of Egypt, thank you, every night of our lives. And so what he learned from Ben Zoma, and Ben Zoma, by the way, if you've ever received an email from me, or a t-shirt, an Accidental Talmudist t-shirt, it says, who is wise? One who learns from every person. That is a saying of Shimon ben Zoma, the Ben Zoma mentioned here. Elazar ben Azariah, brilliant sage, who was actually made head of the academy, head of the Sanhedrin at a very young age, and wasn't respected because he was so young. And so a miracle was performed for him and his hair turned white overnight. And that's why he's like a man of 70. But at any rate, the question is, how do we know that we have to recount the Exodus from Egypt at night? And it's because you will recount the Exodus from Egypt all the days of your life. It could have said, you will recount the Exodus from Egypt the days of your life, on the days of your life, or every day of your life. But this, all the days of your life, according to Ben Zoma, comes to teach that you will recount it in the day as well, or in the night as well as the day. The sages disagreed with Ben Zoma and said, no, all the days comes to mean that we will recount the Exodus from Egypt every day in this world, and we will keep recounting the Exodus from Egypt in the times of the Messiah. Why does that need to be taught? Why wouldn't we recount the Exodus from Egypt at the time of the Messiah? Because when the Messiah finally comes, there will have been other terrible subjugations. Even by the time of the sages, they had terrible times with the Babylonians, with the Persians, with the Greeks, and then particularly with the Romans, who destroyed the temple. And we are understood to still be living in the times of the Roman exile now, because the temple that was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 has never been rebuilt. And Rome, the power that Rome was, is understood to continue as Western civilization. All the sort of succeeding powers that have come sort of are part of that same Roman exile. And when the Messiah comes, we might be tempted to say the Lord who delivered us, from whoever was oppressing us since then, whoever's oppressing us at the time the Messiah comes. But this comes to tell us that no, we must first and foremost thank God for delivering us from Egypt, even though that happened 3,000 years ago, because that is the sort of model set for all time that God delivers us. That was page 12 of the Talmud. I'll stay a little bit longer to try to look at some of these questions. Let me know if there's anything you want to know about. And as I'm waiting for some questions or comments, the takeaway from today. What is our takeaway? I think the takeaway is that the sages acknowledge, how human every human is. Not only the sages, but God, right? Why did God command us to put these fringes on our clothes as a reminder that God brought us out of Egypt, as a reminder that we need to submit to the commandments, as a reminder that our temptation is to deny God, to pursue lust, and to even bow down to idols. Why do we need a reminder to not do all those things? Because we're human. And if we don't remind ourselves constantly, we will slip and fall. That's just part of the human condition. And so we want to have reminders around us. We want to have holy people around us. We want to learn Torah every day and pray every day. Because if we don't, we'll blow it. We'll screw it up. Once we've blown it, God's mercy is infinite, and we always have a chance to make teshuvah, to make atonement, to come back, right? The system is designed not for angels in heaven, but for humans on earth who make mistakes and then work their way back and try to, adopt personal systems to not make those same mistakes again. Woohoo! I was a little out of breath today. I guess there was just a lot to teach. Anyone have a question today? Hitting it today. Wow, what a teaching. And makes his enemy a friend. Did he say that one too? Lincoln said, do I not destroy my enemy when I make him my friend? And didn't we just have, it wasn't today, but it was a couple days ago, the same idea, right? The same idea. Oh, and you know what? I'm sorry, I didn't mention it. But we do have a teaching here in this page that if you have an opportunity to pray for mercy for another person, right? You know someone who needs praying for. You have an ability to pray for that person, and you don't pray for that person, you're considered a sinner. This is not a sinner in the sense of violating a commandment. You're not technically obligated to pray for other people. But the sages are saying it's so valuable to pray for others, both for them and for you, that you are like a sinner if you don't seize that opportunity. That's how important and valuable it is to pray for others when they need it. Sal, do you offer this particular lesson in paper form? I would love to receive it. Sorry, I do not. I do not. We don't have the infrastructure, as it were, to write this all down. But if you go to Accidental Talmudist, the Facebook page, under videos, there's a playlist of AT Daily, and we're adding the video to the playlist every day. So we've got one for every page of the new Talmud reading cycle. All right, my friends, it's been great to learn with you. Sending you lots of love from Los Angeles today, and let us continue lighting up the darkness together.